Okay, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. This is a lecture that's supposed to tackle the legacy of colonial rule to the Philippine economy, using as a primary source OD Corpus, a Philippine Economic History, published by the UP Press in 1997. So, the idea here is for us to have an inkling of how our colonial past had uh, indelible marks in the way our economy evolved. Um, we are essentially taking a political economic approach in understanding the history of underdevelopment in our rural areas, uh, and the uneven status of our rural vis-a-vis compared to our urban areas as well. All of this actually took place, if you were to talk about the genesis, when Magellan landed on our shores, because that was the moment when our local subsistence economy was sutured into the global capitalist economy, so to speak. So, but let's skip that, no? For 300 years, we were under Spanish colonial rule, and one of the indelible effects of Spanish colonial rule was to create a three-tiered social system. At the very top, of course, you had the peninsulares, or the Spanish colonial rulers. Below them would be the principalia, or their local adjuncts, who, on their behalf, uh, manage the resources that they owned after colonizing the islands. And the more populous and majority of those who inhabited the archipelago occupied the last tier, which are essentially your landless peasants who worked for the landlords, who in turn paid taxes in favor of the Spanish colonial government, or if not, the Catholic Church. So when Spain, which was a colonial superpower right about the 16th, 17th century, was dislodged from that position when a new kind of economic order was established. You now have a new economic setup in the global arena, which Spain did not anymore uh, was dominant to. No, they were not that powerful anymore as a nation, because their base, their economic base, was in the period of mercantilism. They were a monarchy, and in order to sustain the monarchy, they had to undertake all these travels, expeditions to the New World, wherein they bring back agricultural raw products or other trading goods to sustain their feudal wars against their neighbors. No? And the Philippines figured as a source of many of these raw materials, and the fact that Magellan reached our shores is indicative of the reach of Spain as a colonial superpower at that time. But while that was happening, a number of shifts also took place at the level of the global economic order, where you did not anymore relied on uh, the produce of the land, but you now had a new kind of economy that produced surplus on the basis of using machineries. So you had the Industrial Revolution taking place in England, in Germany, in the Americas, well, in Northern America, the US, at that time, which superseded the kind of reach and and economic power that Spain enjoyed as a feudal monarchy. And this is the natural progression of economic development. as envisioned by Karl Marx, for instance, no? That there would be a clean break between the feudal order and the industrial order, the modern capitalist system, because the logic of the economy in responding to the question of uh, scarcity is always to to develop on on a progressive linear manner, and that's what happened to Western Europe. No? There was a clean break between the feudal monarchy, and when the economy was ripe for this new kind of arrangement with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution, they also cut off the heads of their monarchies. No? They also cut off the heads of their kings and queens and replaced it with the modern republic. So uh, that's the story of Western Europe, and the Philippines as an outlier, geographically remote, 7,100 islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, uh, came belatedly into this whole worldwide shift. In fact, when the Spain as a superpower was already waning, another superpower took over our islands right at the cusp of our own revolution. It was the first revolution in Asia of the landless peasants with their intelligentsia rising up against a colonial power. No, you were the first in Asia to do that. No, and inspired by the French Revolution a few centuries before, the novels of Victor Hugo. You had their intellectuals in diaspora like Rizal, no, who uh, inculcated all these values of liberation and freedom, uh, bringing back all these ideas and writing the novel No Limitangere and El Filibusterismo. So all of these uh, global transformations eventually found its way to the Philippines. No? First, with the arrival of the Spaniards, the distinct role of the country as a provider of raw materials that was established during the time of the Spaniards. When the Philippines was sold to America for a few $1,000,000, that same kind of assignment, economic assignment, did not change. And you can see this in the work of O.D. Corpus. No? American officials saw the Philippines as an adjunct of the American economy, and primarily they imagined the country as a dumping ground for their processed goods, because they were a new superpower producing so much industrial goods, soap, finished products, canned goods, so on and so forth. And having a colony meant that they can freely sell all these capitalist goods into our shores. Okay, so that's the benefit of having a colony. They saw the population as a market for their finished goods. At the same time, they maintained the same kind of economy that the Spaniards enjoyed, no? By essentially using the local economy as the source for their raw materials too as well. But they did not, in other words, think about what is good for the Filipinos, what is good for the economy of the country, but they always thought in terms of what is good for the American economy and how they can make use of the resources of their new colony. So there's a continuing thread from the Spanish colonial history up to the American Commonwealth period, where you have colonial powers essentially doing the same thing. What is that? No? To plunder local resources for their benefit and gain. So, and that's not a moral judgment. That's just the way colonialism, and we have a new term for that under capitalism, it's how imperialism works, no? You use your colonies as a source of your raw materials, and you then dump your finished goods into them, no? So we were all part of the whole expansionist American project, no? And that meant harnessing the untapped resources that the Spaniards were not able to uh, access for one reason or another. One of the resources that they were keen on accessing was land, of course. No, by they and this is something that we will discuss in a little bit. How they were able to apply the Regalian doctrine and declare all public land as the property of the Commonwealth, American colonial government. Okay, so uh, this is according to the report of the Philippine Commission, which was sent to Manila in 1896. No, um, they noted that there were 29 million hectares of land in the Philippines. 2 million of this was in private ownership, and a greater portion, 27 million plus in public land. The land is most exceedingly fertile, much of it covered by the most valuable timber, with extensive deposits of gold, copper, high-grade iron, and excellent coal. So what happens was that the Americans imagined the Philippines as a source for their raw materials. They would ship all these timber, minerals, tobacco, corn, all these other goods that the Spaniards were already producing then. But now they ramp up the expansion and the production. Bring them to their processing facilities either in Manila or either in Manila, abroad, or in Cebu. And under their imprimatur, these finished products would be sold back to the local population or elsewhere, no? As they saw fit, no? And this was all, undertaken in the relationship of what O.D. Corpus said as he has a term for it. No? Let me just pull it out. Economy of special relations. Okay, excuse me. The economy of special relations that America enjoyed with their colony meant that they can have free access to raw materials without control, and free access also to markets without control. If they see fit, for instance, that local markets are in competition with local Philippine markets are in competition with American markets, for instance, in the production of tobacco, then they would impose quotas. But the Philippines cannot impose restrictions on the entry of their goods. There are a number of laws which you probably heard about, which are examples of these unequal arrangements with the U.S. No? The Payne-Aldrich law is one, where you had the duty-free treatment of Philippine exports, manufactured or otherwise, to the United States, except sugar and tobacco, which were free of duty only in amounts that did not exceed prescribed quotas. And so America was a sugar-producing country, particularly Cuba, and they did not want us to compete with their products there. No? On the other hand, all U.S. exports were totally duty-free and not subject to quota limits. This was the Payne-Aldrich law. No? What does this mean? Between raw materials that we export with quotas, no, to America, and finished goods which we import from America to the Philippines, which do you think has more added value? Which products will retain their value within the country where they were produced? Of course, the finished product will be a lot more expensive. The raw materials will be cheap. Under this arrangement, it would be the landlord who will enjoy that kind of relationship with their U.S. principal sponsor, and then the exporter from the U.S. will enjoy the super profits out of their production. No? What is the effect of all of this? No, in the first decades of American colonial rule, You did not encourage industrialization, even though we were a growing economy, no? On population alone, no? I think population growth was exponential during the American colonial period, in the sense that, according to the census at the turn of the century, there were only about 7 million Filipinos. By 1939, there were about 30 million already, or 27 million, thereabouts, no? So it was a period of unprecedented population growth, which was probably enough to fuel the growth of a local economy based on consumption alone. But the economy did not benefit from that kind of population growth, because the U.S. Uh, wanted to dump their goods and enjoy that population growth, because we were their colony. So instead of producing our own soap, our own toothpaste, our own Procter and Gamble products like Colgate, Lifebuoy, whatever you have, what happened was that we imported all of this, no? And what our local producers were also your the old uh, peninsulares, or the old Principalia. They also enjoyed this relationship because they exported, for instance, the raw materials that would end up in the toothpaste uh, and the soap that Procter and Gamble were producing. No, in other words, America introduced a very efficient modern government which promoted public health, but it was also complementary to their economic interests, in the sense that by teaching us it's important to brush our teeth or to wash our hands, it also complemented the production of their industries, because they now had a market for their toothpaste and their soap. And that bid well also for the local Principalia, who were more than willing to produce the raw materials for these soaps and these toothpaste. And what is that? No, copra. They would process copra first stage here, and then they would send it to Manila, Cebu, or the industrial centers, who would process this into to soap, no? And then sold back to us. But the profit would. So what the consequence of all of this is stunted industrialization. No? There were a number of early manufacturers which produced a number of products that did not fly, because they just could not compete with the efficiency and the uh, benefits that the American corporations enjoyed, given the unequal trade. And the result of all of this was the formation of the local economy as export oriented. And what you're exporting here are not manufactured goods but raw materials, but import dependent, no? But we and yet we export our raw materials, but we need the finished goods coming from America to sustain the needs of the local economy, of the growing population. And another consequence of the American colonial government was their failure to implement land reform. No? Um, the problem with the U.S. was that they got it right in the other places that they colonized. For instance, in the post-war era, 1950s, probably they learned their lesson from the Philippines, and how underdevelopment can actually fuel social unrest. Now they had this Cold War with the Soviet bloc, China, and communism, no? In the 1950s. So when they came in to secure South Korea from the influence of China in the north, uh, what they did was to implement a very successful land reform program, which broke up the dominance of the landed class in South Korea. And that land reform allowed for local markets to develop, and a certain amount of money to circulate within the economy, which sustained economic growth. No? And at some point, that became the basis for the establishment of uh, national industrialization in a country like Korea. But the problem with the Philippines was that, well, maybe it was their first experiment, but they did the same to Cuba. Uh, they did the same to Haiti. No? Uh, they did not develop these economies, no? But instead they uh, extracted, just like the old model of colonial rule. They extracted resources from these colonies that they took over. So the problem with the Philippines was that, apart from maintaining the mode of the economy in the same way that the Spaniards plundered the economy for 300 years, the Americans practically did the same with little change. No? But the Americans also did not take the opportunity to transform the social landscape by implementing a comprehensive, effective, genuine land reform. They did not do that. No? And that's something that the Americans um, must, think about as a lasting legacy. But going back to the idea of export-oriented, an example of this is really the problem of rice, and it's just, you know, um shocking to me to note that even during the time of the American colonial period, and probably even during the time of uh, the Spaniards, we already had a problem with rice production, and it was seen even then by the Americans that it would be more efficient, economically efficient, to import rice than to produce rice, because they would rather use the land for export crops. Anyway, you can always import staple good from Indochina, from Thailand, from Vietnam, even as early as then. So the rice problem, no, and we still have that even up to now, a staple such as rice, which makes it very volatile when it comes to fluctuating prices. No? If at some point the global economic order will not allow for the travel of goods from one place to another, the Philippines will go hungry because we are not producing enough rice to feed our local population. That has always been the case then. That's also true right now. For the Americans, producing export crops was much more profitable than producing rice domestically, and therefore all support was to be directed in favor of the export crops, and rice was to be imported at a cheap price as possible. No? You can see here in this table the top export crops from 1903 to 1939. And what are these? Palay, corn, sugarcane, coconut, abaca, tobacco. The same things that we were producing during the time of the Spaniards. No? And the Americans also did not implement land reform, as I mentioned a while ago. They tried to implement a law on land ownership, but it was so flawed, designed so flawed, that it ended up benefiting the same Principalia class who wanted to accumulate more land, more resources. No? You're familiar with the whole idea of tax declaration, diba? So what the Americans, when they took over the country, was to identify which of these lands are privately owned, and they were only able to identify, based upon the Spanish records, a few or significant number of privately owned land from the haciendas of the friars, from the few peninsulares who owned thousands of hectares of land, and they compensated this. No, they paid these private individuals, even the church, some amount of money so that it can be expropriated, and they can dispose of it as they please by selling it to a American company or whatever. What they failed to do was to allow local landless peasants the opportunity to own the land they've been tilling, even before the arrival of the Spaniards, even under their landlords, and continuing up to the American colonial rule. By legal fiat, America declared all of this as public land, and you can only have a title to that land under American Commonwealth law if you satisfy a number of uh, requirements, such as uh, you're there, you've planted on the land for 5 years, and you paid the tax declaration for it. So that's kind of interesting, because even up to now, that's still a problem. If you're an uneducated local peasant who lives somewhere in Malitbog, Bukidnon, and you have no idea that the Americans have established a new rule or a new system, di ba? What 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 how would you be able to secure uh, a land title for your family and for yourself? No read, no write ka. So what happened was that it benefited the local Principalia class, or the burgeoning landlord class, who wanted to expand their properties, because even though they weren't there, they applied for tax declarations and paid taxes for 5 years on all of these lands. At some point, it became theirs, and you see that problem happening in indigenous territory even up to now. No? But that started even during the time of the Spaniards. No? There's a problem with the tax declaration. Unfortunately, again, this worked against the small farmers, no? According to O.D. Corpus. The illiterates were vulnerable to unscrupulous large landowners who paid the tax on the small parcels adjoining their properties. The farmers lost their fields and were evicted, and some became tenant sharecroppers. So you were a productive peasant, far from civilization before. You didn't have title to your own land, but at some point during this period, some mestizo Kano or Spanish mestizo will come to you and show you a piece of land and evicting you because you don't have private property ownership according to American Commonwealth law. The result of all of this, of course, was peasant unrest and rural underdevelopment. No? Why peasant unrest? Because imagine, no, the cry of the Philippine revolutionaries, which were mostly made up of the peasant class, is something related to the fact that they've been tilling on their land, and yet the Spaniards and the Principalia were the ones who were enjoying the fruits of their labor. Uh, and that's why one of the reasons why they waged the revolution against Spain, and they won that revolution until the Americans stepped in, was because they wanted to have access to their own land. That's the freedom that they imagined, so that they will work not for any landlord or any Espanol, but for themselves and their families. But what happened during the American period was the Americans maintained that kind of system, because it was easier to talk to one landlord who owned vast tracts of land for the source of their raw materials, such as copra, corn, tobacco. It was easier to do things that way instead of talking to many small farmers. And they did not want to liberate the Filipinos from the shackles of slavery. They wanted to exploit the economy, and the local peasant class was an important element. If you have a local peasant class, that means that you have a very cheap source of labor to produce all these goods, and that benefited the local Principalia class as well, because they would just sit pretty and wait for the harvest, and then they would export all of this and have a cut in the profits. It also resulted to uneven development between the rural and urban areas. When the Americans took over, they established processing centers in urban areas such as Cebu, Iloilo. The Spaniards already did this even before, but the Americans probably improved the process and the concentration of these industries within these urban centers. And because they were plundering the rural areas, there's a natural tendency for the local population to move out of these rural areas and converge in the cities. So you have the phenomenon of urbanization also taking place during this time, and you have places like Manila, Cebu, which started to attract local migrants, and that became the story of our urban centers, which are heavily populated. Where do most of these people come from? From rural areas, because of the underdevelopment in the rural areas. Why is there underdevelopment in the rural areas? Because that's the nature of the economy. The rural areas is a source of raw materials which has little added value. So all that labor does not go back to those rural areas. So the urban centers suck all of these profit and concentrate all this economic activity in the urban areas. That is why there is also rural undevelopment, a mirror image of what takes place. So thus there were both internal and external factors on the onset which shaped the Philippine rural economy. You had, of course, the Spanish and then American economic interests, which are, of course, consequence of global capitalist demands, because they're a reflection of the changes taking place on a global scale. And the whole idea behind colonialism is, of course, to use their military power as a means to extract resources from their colonies. In the age of capitalism, of course, we call that as imperialism. But this is complemented by conditions at the local level. The Spaniards created a power structure, a class system within the country, which followed the logic of a local principalia, the elite, acting as a mediator between the colonial ruler and the local peasant class, which serves as your labor force. Okay, that was established by the Spaniards. When the Americans came, they exploited that kind of power structure because that kind of class system works well for their interests of extracting as much resources from the local economy. The consequence of this is a stunting of industrial growth. Okay, so we were set for disaster at the onset because of our colonial past. No? Our colonial past structured the economy in a certain way which created a social system which benefited that kind of economic arrangement, which always operated on the needs of the colonial power. When the Americans took over, that kind of system did not change. So what you have here is the distortions of our colonial history in our economy, and how that local economy also gave rise to a distorted political and social system. That's a legacy of our colonial past, no? Export-oriented, import-dependent, and a class system that made that whole economic arrangement possible. What is that class arrangement? You have a principalia class in between who extract resources at the behest of their colonial masters. And then you have a mass of landless peasants who were economically disenfranchised for hundreds of years and remain so even in the 20th century. That's where underdevelopment and the poverty of the country emanates from, if you look at it from a political economic perspective. What happened in the post-war period? Did that change? Did the political system also change? Because after 1939, then you had the Second World War. The American government granted us independence eventually. The 1950s was therefore a very important period in our country's history. But we'll get to that in the next lecture on landlords, capitalists, and your politicians. Thank you for listening for now.